We are delighted to have with us the Right Honourable David Cameron, Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, 2010 to 2016, who will be in conversation with the Editor-in-Chief, HT Digital Streams, Bobby Ghosh. For this session, ladies and gentlemen, a reminder that you can write down your questions and our hostesses will collect them and hand them over to Mr. Ghosh. Before the former Prime Minister of the UK joins us, we have a short film on him.
Conservatives suffered their worst election defeat in 150 years.
The virtual wipeout of the Tory party.
The contrast with Labour could not have been more marked.
A new dawn has broken, has it not?
Tony Blair has won a third term.
The Conservatives have been through bleak years, and some question the appetite for change.
We can change this party and we can change this country.
Could this possibly, just maybe, be the leader we've been waiting for?
A modern, compassionate conservatism is right for our time and right for our country.
David Cameron was relaunching his party and forcing through a modern agenda.
There is today a modern conservative alternative that has got the leadership, that's got the energy, that's got the values to get this country moving. You are voting for hope, you're voting for optimism, you're voting for change, you're voting for the fresh start our country so badly needs.
Britain has a new Prime Minister.
Her Majesty the Queen has asked me to form a new government, and I have accepted. I aim to form a proper and full coalition.
David Cameron now has the keys to number 10. He now needs to use those keys to unlock the door to financial recovery.
We inherited public finances that can only be described as catastrophic.
The UK economy shrank at its fastest rate.
Rising unemployment is still a...
If we pull together to deal with these debts today, just a few years down the line, the rewards will be felt by everyone in our country.
The UK is out of recession.
Growth stood at 2.8% last year. That's faster than any other G7 country.
The unemployment rate has fallen to its lowest level.
5 years on, the deficit is halved, 2 million people are back in work, the economy is growing faster than any major economy in the Western world.
Great Britain and the United States are two economies that are standing out at a time when a lot of other countries are having problems.
I think you only need 2 words to sum up these gains. Britain delivered. I believe we've made great steps, with more people in work than ever before in our history, with reforms to welfare and education, increasing people's life chances, and enabling those who love each other to get married, whatever their sexuality.
It is time for the British people to have their say. So the next Conservative manifesto will give the British people an in-out referendum.
Voters in the UK are going to the polls today in one of the most unpredictable general elections in decades.
A hung parliament with no clear winner. That's what the opinion polls had persistently predicted.
Here it is, 10 o'clock, and we are saying the Conservatives are the largest party.
David Cameron is headed for a second term this morning.
An outright win for the Conservatives.
All the polls said that it was far too close to call.
The result that came out of the blue. The Prime Minister walked back through this, the most famous front door in the land.
"10 years ago, I stood on a stage, quite like this one, and I said that if we changed our party, we could change our country. With couples married because of us, working people backed because of us, the NHS safe because of us, and children in the poorest part of the world saved by us, growing our economy, jobs, exports, growth, infrastructure, a country raising its sights, its people reaching new heights, a greater Britain, made of greater hope, greater chances, greater security. It is the journey of a one-nation, modern, compassionate Conservative party."
The British people have voted to leave the European Union, and their will must be respected. Now the decision has been made to leave, we need to find the best way. And I will do everything I can to help. I love this country, and I feel honoured to have served it. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Right Honourable David Cameron.
chance, would I take any of it back? It's a fine romance, but it's let me start.
Well, good morning. Namaste. It is great to be back in India. And can I first of all thank Shobina Bhatia for putting on such a brilliant conference and for inviting me to speak to you and spend some time with you today. And it really is, for me, great to be back in India. This is the first country outside Europe that I visited when I was leader of the opposition back in 2006. It is the first country that I visited outside Europe when I became Prime Minister in 2010. And I'm proud that once again, this is the first time I'm making a public speech outside Europe, and I'm back once again with you in India. And every time I come, I am blown away by the progress and by the potential that I see. Standing here today in the world's fastest growing large economy for the second year in a row, and a country in which you are making bold decisions in an attempt to fast forward to the very bright future that clearly you have ahead of you. And that's the first thing I want to say, is that I am genuinely passionate about this relationship that we have between Britain and India. And it's not just those shared ties of history and language and culture. It's not just the amazing 1.5 million Indian diaspora in the United Kingdom that make such an amazing contribution to my country. Nor is it even our shared love of the beautiful game of cricket. I see that the little master is going to be here later on. Given the way the test series is going, I may need to kidnap him for some extra tuition and training. It's not only those things, it is actually that I believe that Britain and India have a very modern partnership. A modern partnership based on jobs and investment. India now the third biggest investor into the United Kingdom, investing more in my country than in the rest of the European Union combined. And Britain, the largest big country investor into India. Bigger than America, bigger than Germany, bigger than France, responsible for 1 in 20 private sector jobs. That is a modern industrial partnership. It is also a modern partnership in terms of this appalling threat that we both face in terms of fighting and defeating terrorism, particularly Islamist extremist terrorism. And I admire what your Prime Minister has said about wanting a clear and common definition of terrorists. There are no more good terrorists or bad terrorists. There are simply terrorists. And whatever country they are in, all countries have a responsibility to stand up to them, to bring them to justice, and put an end to what they do. And it is a thoroughly modern partnership in the shared goals that we have in all the modern endeavors that India is attempting. When I look at your program of smart cities, I'm proud that Britain is playing a part in terms of planning and technology. When I look at your Skill India program, I'm proud that British institutions and British qualifications can help you to achieve those goals. When I look at the massive infrastructure program and funding program that you have, I'm proud that British finance and the City of London can help you to achieve that. As Prime Minister Modi said in that great speech at Wembley, in a way perhaps only he could, James Bond, Brooke Bond, Rupee Bond. I learned many lessons actually as Prime Minister, some things not to do. Never play golf with Barack Obama, you'll never win. Don't go to a party with Silvio Berlusconi. And probably don't appear on a platform in front of 60,000 people with Narendra Modi. You'll never compete with his rhetoric and his ability to connect with an audience. I learned some things. But I'm passionate about this relationship, and as an ex-Prime Minister, I will continue to do all I can to build that relationship between Britain and India. Now, the second thing I want to say is to quote that Chinese proverb, that Chinese curse of may you live in interesting times, and we certainly do in the world today. And when you have seen
the Brexit vote in the UK, the unexpected presidential election victory in the United States, when you've seen the growth of anti-system, populist and sometimes quite extreme political parties in Western Europe, I'm not surprised that you pick as your theme this morning is the West in crisis. However, I want to come this morning and give you a thoroughly optimistic message. It may be odd for me, someone who lost their job because of this populist upsurge, to give you this optimistic message. As my son said to me as I got ready to go to the airport to fly to Delhi, he said, you just saw a picture of him, he said, well, Dad, why are you wearing a suit? It's not as if you've got a job or anything. But I do have an optimistic message. Let me be clear, though, before I give that optimistic message. I still believe it would have been better for Britain to remain inside the European Union. Our neighbours are our partners and our friends and our allies, and I wanted us to stay in the room with them when they make decisions that affect us and our continent. And I still believe in the things that President-elect Trump denounced in the campaign. I'm a great believer in the global free trading system. I'm a strong believer in NATO. I believe we must stand up to countries like Russia that invade their neighbors. I believe in independent central banks. I don't believe you should blame religions for terrorism. You should instead blame those that pervert a great religion for terrorism. So why the optimism? Well, I believe that modern political leaders shouldn't complain about the circumstances they face. Their job is to make the most of those circumstances for their country. And let me give you the two optimistic messages I want to put forward this morning. The first is that this is not the end of globalization. The demand for and the benefit of free trade, travel, specialization, technology, innovation, these things are not going away. But we do need to understand very profoundly the things that have happened that have caused the events that we've seen in Europe and the wider world over the last year. And I believe there are two things that are happening, and we have to understand and react to both of them. We have, if you like, to make a major course correction to address these two things. The first is economic. While globalization has been a massive success for so many in our countries, in our world, there's no doubt that some people have felt left behind, that we've seen a stagnation in the wages of some in our countries, and we need to do better at addressing and helping those people who so far have been left behind by globalization. In our country, we've introduced minimum wages, we've taken the poorest out of taxation, we've put programs in to improve schools in areas of the country that most need them, but there's more to be done. We have to address that economic effect of globalization. But there's another phenomenon happening too, and it is a more cultural phenomenon, which is that there are those in our countries who feel left behind by the pace of change in their communities, by the mass movement of people, by very high levels of migration. This is part of the concern that led to the Brexit vote and indeed to other things that we've seen in our world over the last year. And I believe we need to address that with just as much vigor as we address the economic question as well. But I'm fundamentally optimistic because I believe that the mainstream political parties in our countries are fully capable of making the course correction to adjust to both of those phenomena. And if we do that, then globalization and the success of globalization can continue. Second optimistic message, and that is that Brexit is not a dead end for Britain. The British people have made their choice in that referendum. We now need to deliver that choice. And as we do so, we need to look for the advantages that we can find in the path that the British people have chosen. And if you step back from what inevitably will be a difficult negotiation between Britain and the European Union, if you step back and look at the bigger picture, you can see that Britain
the 5th largest economy in the world, and the European Union, the largest trading market in the world, there is a clear mutual interest in building a partnership that works for both. And that is what we must do. We must find a way to make this partnership work for both of us. And in the end, Britain will be moving, I believe, from a situation where we were inside the European Union, but out of many of its parts. We didn't join the single currency. We never took down our border controls. We were never going to join a European army. So we were in the European Union, but out of many of its elements. Now we're going to be out of the European Union, but quite probably in some of its elements, working together for our common security, making sure our economies can succeed. That is the big and the rational picture that we should work towards. But let me finish my remarks by saying this. I am optimistic on these two fronts, that we're not seeing the end of globalization and we can see a strong and successful Britain in the world. But we will only achieve this optimistic vision if we address the problems of globalization square on, as I've said. We'll only achieve this vision if we defeat the protectionists and make all over again the case for free trade and for specialization that have benefited our two countries so much. And we will also only succeed if we hold very fast to the key values that make modern India and modern Britain success stories. And in my view, those key values are a belief in both democracy and in the power of modern market economics. It is those two things together that give us, I believe, the edge over the other countries with which we compete. And I think this is the right country in which to make that message. After all, our partnership, the modern partnership between Britain and India, is a partnership between the world's oldest democracy and the world's largest democracy. And we should be proud of those democratic values, just as we're proud of the economic success that we want to see for our two great nations for the future. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, David, for joining us and for that very optimistic take on the future. I'm sure a lot of people feel reassured by that. If I can ask you, not just representing the UK or British politics, but representing the West in general, it seems like Brexit was one example, the US election is the other, and we've seen echoes of this all over the West. People going to elections or referenda seem to be consumed with a sense of fear and hatred. What are you so afraid of? And what do you hate so much?
Well, as I said, I think that, if I take my own country, actually we are an economic and political success story. When I was re-elected Prime Minister in 2015, unemployment was falling, the economy was growing. We had more people in work than ever before in our history. People's take-home pay was starting to rise. Living standards were rising. But these two phenomena that I described are present in Britain. If anything, they're even more present in the United States of America. And there's a common theme across Europe. And it is that while some people are doing well from globalization, there are too many who are left behind, who don't see the advantages. And we have to address that. I think for too long there was just a sense that in the end, the rising tide would lift all the boats, and that hasn't happened. And so we need to course correct. And I think you see that with the new British Prime Minister, with the emphasis on making sure there's genuine opportunity for everybody, that we increase skills and training. We have this new minimum wage. We take the poorest people out of taxation. We've got to demonstrate that the system that we believe in can deliver for those people. And the issue of immigration is, and cultural change in our countries, I think is a very important one. People have felt that the pace of change has been too fast. And I say this as someone from a country which is very proud of our multi-ethnic, multiracial democracy. I'm not saying Britain is perfect, but actually, look at the British cabinet today. We have in our aid secretary the daughter of Gujarati immigrants from East Africa first generation, second generation, she's sitting in the cabinet. Our business secretary, his father left rural Pakistan to come and drive the buses in London. In one generation, he is in charge of British industry and commerce, now doing the local government job. So, I'm not saying we're perfect, but we are an opportunity democracy, a genuine opportunity democracy. But we've got to demonstrate that is there for everybody. If we do that, but it's a course correction that's required, not a fundamental change.
Perhaps unsurprisingly, I just quickly glanced through some of the questions that came from the audience. Several of them asked the same question. Would you have done things differently? Would you have not taken your country into this referendum?
No, I think the referendum was the right thing to do. I mean, after all, we've just been talking about how fundamentally Western countries need to address the causes of populism and not push them to one side. Now, one of the things people were unhappy about and uneasy about in the United Kingdom, quite understandably, was that this organization to which we belong, the European Union, had changed quite fundamentally over the 40 years since we had joined it, and yet the British people had never been asked, at the time of the various treaties increasing its power, had never been asked for their opinion. And so if you're going to address the causes of populism, just as you need to properly control immigration, just as you need to demonstrate the economy works for everyone, you have to address this question too, and that is why I held the referendum. Now, my argument was we were better off staying in but reforming the European Union, staying out of the things we didn't like, but the contrary case won, that we should leave altogether and then work out a new relationship with Europe. Now, obviously, I regret that decision because I was very strongly on one side of the argument, but I'm a Democrat, and I don't believe as a Democrat you can regret holding a referendum or abiding by its result.
Slightly different question. You're a Prime Minister, a politician who took a couple of enormous risks. One paid off, the Scottish vote, and the other didn't. You're in a country now where you have a Prime Minister who's taken an enormous risk. You got a chance to meet him. What is going on in his head, do you think, as a person who's been in that place?
Well, first of all, let me say, I don't believe what I did. I don't see that as risk. I see it as having a strategy and a plan.
Well, that's what he says too.
Well, I'll come on to what I think is happening here, which is fascinating, while trying to stay out of Indian politics. But with Scotland, we had in the United Kingdom a Scottish Independence Party elected to the Scottish Parliament. I could have said, no, you can't have a referendum. But if I'd done that, that only would have increased the cause of Scottish independence.
Yes.
So I had a strategy and a plan to try and keep our United Kingdom together. Again, with Europe, I feel we had to take on the argument about Britain's place and where we were going to be and did we want to stay in this organization or not. And the British people have now made the choice. Now, as a result, actually, the populist movement in the UK has been very much reduced. Now, moving on to Indian politics, I mustn't get involved in the...
Oh, please do.
What I will say, I'll simply say this, that, many people looking at a country like India have said, you need to get to grips with corruption. You need to move your economy to one where more people are banking rather than not banking. You need to move and, if possible, fast forward towards a more digital economy. And crucially, I think, in terms of development, you need to grow your tax base. Because in the end, what is the constraint on India's growth? This fantastic performing economy you have, one of the greatest constraints is the funding for infrastructure so that the growth can continue. So I don't want to get into the procedural approaches of what has happened, but if you make progress, banking more of your economy, moving to a digital economy, tackling corruption, and crucially enlarging your tax base, those are worthy objectives, and I think people should applaud the ambition to make progress on them.
Right. We're talking about the West, and which was the theme of your talk earlier. We're now looking across the channel and seeing reflections of Brexit and of the American vote in France, possibly in Italy, even tomorrow, the big referendum there. If France goes the way Britain did, and if Italy goes the way Britain did, Is that the end of the European ideal? Is that the end of the Western order?
Well, this is a very, getting into predictions in 2016 has been a
No,
very
I'm
dangerous.
not asking you to predict.
No, but
I'm saying if that happens.
Yeah. Look, if that were to happen,
Yes.
if France were to elect Marine Le Pen,
Yeah.
that would be obviously a very big body blow for the European project. But if I think what I expect to happen, my argument would be, first of all, I expect that Britain will leave the European Union, and second, I don't expect the European Union to fall apart. Now, why do I feel that? Well, having spent 6 years sitting around the European Council table with 27 other leaders, I can see that while Britain has always had its misgivings with this organization, indeed I have my misgivings with this organization, we never liked the idea of a commission, a civil service making laws. We never really liked the idea of a European Parliament when we had such a strong and historic parliament of our own. Britain's commitment to Europe was very much a utilitarian one. We were there because we thought it was in our economic interests to trade and cooperate. We never really liked the political project of Europe. We tried to get out of that while staying in. That didn't work. I always felt that the other countries were more enthusiastic about the political project. And to people who believe Europe definitely will break up, in many ways I would point to the example of Greece. Now, if you look at Greece, I believe the euro is fundamentally quite a flawed project because it's a single currency but without a single tax and single banking system behind it. Now, if you look at Greece, they have suffered enormously. They've seen a large portion of their economy wiped out. They've seen high unemployment. And yet, even with a left-wing anti-system party, they remain committed to being in the euro and in the European Union. And I use that example just as a way of saying people shouldn't underestimate the commitment of other European countries to cleave to the European Union as an organization. Now, as I say, predictions are a very difficult business, but I think the French electoral system favors, in the end, the two-ballot process favors a mainstream party that can unite people behind their candidacy in the second ballot. And that's what I'd expect to happen. Italy isn't voting on membership of the European Union, but clearly the consequences could be very hard to predict. But just as I've said, we have to course correct in favor of more economic inclusiveness and to address the problems of migration and the movement of people. Clearly, the Eurozone has massive challenges because some countries, like Italy, have seen stagnant growth for year after year after year, and that ultimately is unsustainable.
You mentioned Marine Le Pen and you mentioned Theresa May earlier. Speaking of leaders, boy, aren't you so glad you don't have to deal with Donald Trump? Isn't that a fringe benefit?
Look, I had things to say about some of the things he said in his election campaign. But, ultimately, as I said, modern leaders have to make the most of their circumstances. And I think let's start to look for the positives of the new situation. Now, I mentioned some of the things I'm concerned about. I'm a NATO man, I'm a free trade man, I'm an independent central bank man, so some of the things that have been said worry me. But, one of the first things I think that will happen is a reform to American tax law that will see a return of American corporate money into America and a stronger American economic performance, which I think is good for the world economy. I think that it is right to ask other European countries to increase their defense budgets. Britain is the only major country in the world that has kept both its NATO 2% of GDP defense spending pledge and its 0.7% of national income on aid spending, achieved that under my prime ministership. So the fact the new American president is going to put pressure on other European countries to spend more on their defense in the light of what's happened in Ukraine, I think is a good thing. So let's start to look for some advantages and let's work out how we're going to work together.
Yeah, but his view of Ukraine is very different. He doesn't see Putin as a threat. He sees him as a hero almost.
Well, I think, look, it's going to be a job for the new British Prime Minister and others in Europe to discuss this issue with the American president. I would argue from my own experience. I was opposition leader when Georgia was under assault from effectively a Russian-sponsored operation. I flew to Tbilisi, actually, in the middle of that conflict when I was opposition leader. And I think what happened afterwards is the world complained vigorously at the time and then effectively turned away, and very few consequences followed. And I think from that, you can then see the next things that happened. And I think history teaches us, recent history, but also more modern European history teaches us of the danger of turning away when one country violates the sovereignty of another. So I think the lessons are there for anyone who studies and looks carefully at how best to handle what Russia has done in Eastern Europe.
Yeah, studies and looks carefully are the two operative words there. I'm not sure that applies to Donald Trump yet.
Well, he hasn't got the job yet. He's appointing his cabinet. American.
He also seems
American
to have appointed
European...
the British ambassador to the UK already.
Well, we have an excellent ambassador in the United States who I was responsible for appointing, and one of his telegrams was published, and it made pretty good sense to me. So I'm happy with that.
Okay, if I can come back to the theme that you addressed in your remarks at first, and you brought it up a couple of times here. You say that it is important to re-engage with people who are afraid and who are filled with fear and hatred. To re-engage with them, to reiterate the importance of global trade and to fight back against the impulse to protectionism, to also explain why immigration, or to re-engage on the subject of immigration. How do you do that? How would you speak differently on the subject of immigration today than you did at Prime Minister, knowing what you do know now?
Well, I would argue that when I became Prime Minister, I made a pledge of wanting to reduce levels of net migration, the difference between people leaving Britain to live and work elsewhere and people coming to Britain to live and work. I wanted to reduce the numbers from the historically high levels that they had reached. To begin with, I was successful in that endeavor. We saw a reduction in net migration. But then, for all sorts of reasons, which probably too lengthy to go into here, I wasn't successful and the numbers went up again. And I don't think the British people are in any way unreasonable about migration. They support a multiracial, multi-ethnic Britain. They know that generations of people have come to our country and contributed a huge amount. But I think they have a perfectly rational complaint that in recent years, the levels have been too high, the abuses have been too great, and the control has been too weak. And we have to address that. One of the reasons I made my pledge back in 2010 was I could remember in the 1980s when net migration was lower, and as a result, immigration wasn't an issue in politics at all. And I think we should be aiming to return to that time where there's sufficient control that people feel this issue is being properly dealt with. But let me, make the point to an important audience here. You can control immigration while still making your country an attractive place for people to come and live and work and study. And even with the controls that we put in place and the controls I expect that will follow, particularly on European migration, today, and I expect into the future, there's no limit on the number of students, including Indian students, who can come and study in British universities. You need to have a university place, you need to have an English language qualification, but there's no limit on the numbers. So we can be open, we can be attractive, we can be economically successful, but we have to demonstrate control at the same time.
There's a question, I'm going to begin to take some questions from the audience.
Sure.
There's a question from Zarover Gill asking, and this is an interesting question because it comes ahead of the referendum in Italy tomorrow. There have also been, in this country, sometimes a tendency to think that perhaps referendums rather than just elections would be a good idea for the big issues of the day. Your record with referendums is one success, one failure, if I could say that.
I had three, actually. I won two. One on the electoral system,
that's right.
one on Scottish independence. But
are referendums a good way to address big questions like this?
I think the rule I would have is we are both representative democracies. We elect people to Parliament to look at these vital issues, make decisions on our behalf, hold the government to account, and then we can either approve those representatives at elections or we can throw them out. That is our parliamentary system. So we shouldn't use referendums for issues properly discussed by Parliament. But it seems to me there are some issues that go above Parliament, issues that are about how your country is governed, the rules for governing your country, or indeed your membership of international organizations, particularly if they have a role in power and in legislation and in other ways. So it seems to me the referendums I held were entirely justified. The electoral system, the way in which we vote for our representatives, that is like one of the key rules of the game. And I think Parliament changing the rules of the game without consulting the people, I think, is a potential problem. With whether one part of your country wants to secede from your union, that is clearly something that you need to go over the heads of Parliament to the people. And I would argue again with Europe, one of the reasons we needed to have the referendum is that we joined Europe in 1972. There was a referendum on our membership in 1975. But between 1975 and 2016, there were a lot of treaties that changed the power of Europe with respect to Great Britain. Treaties of Maastricht, of Nice, of Amsterdam, of Lisbon, that made quite profound changes. My party, mostly in opposition during those years, argued for referendums. We didn't have them. And that, I think, is why it was so justified to have a referendum on the big issue of in or out at the time when we did. So that is the role for referendums, not to supplant parliamentary democracy, but when you are deciding bigger issues that go above Parliament.
Latika Tandon asks, the world seems to be moving towards protectionist policies. What is your view for the future of free trade across the world? So to the question I asked earlier, I think this reflects that we didn't close that loop, which is, how do you now restate to a highly anxious Western world the importance of free trade?
I think we have to, I think politicians of my generation and some of the ones above have perhaps taken for granted that people understand there are benefits from free trade. And I think we need to go back to first principles and explain that if countries specialize and trade with each other, it is mutually beneficial. It is not dividing up one cake, it is growing the size of the cake and sharing it out through a process of trade. That's the first point. And the second point is that trade and specialization can lead to huge increases of productivity. We produce more per person, and if we do that, we can receive the benefit in higher wages and higher living standards. Trading countries, countries that trade between each other, build strong and often friendly relations, and that has another benefit. And Britain, I think, is well placed to make this argument. Our decision to leave the European Union, I don't think was linked to a movement in favor of protectionism. It wasn't an issue very much in the campaign about Europe's trade deals with America or with Canada. Those were not election issues. And if you look at Britain today, the fact that, our premier car manufacturer, Jaguar Land Rover, the fact that is owned by an Indian company, Tata, that is not a source of shame or embarrassment. It's a source of great pride that we together, the Indian capital, British skills and technology, have built a new manufacturing giant. That's a source of great pride. So I think Britain's quite well placed in the modern world to make the argument again from first principles that international trade makes us all wealthier.
So much of the fear of globalization in the West is the loss of jobs and the fear that jobs will never come back. And so often now when you hear of talk of recovery, it is the expression jobless recovery is now practically a daily occurrence. How do you address that anxiety?
Well, by pointing to the evidence. I became Prime Minister in 2010. I finished in 2016. During that time, we created every day a net 1,000 new jobs. There are more people in work in Britain today than ever in our history, more women in work than ever before in our history. Now, you then go to the argument, well, what sort of jobs are these? And it's certainly true that in the US, you can see a greater evidence of the reduction in middle-class jobs. In Britain, it's harder to see that. We've actually seen a growth in jobs at various different income levels. And I think, again, we have to make this argument that, of course, we're not going to succeed if we try to cling on to low-cost, low-value-added jobs. What we have to do is to make sure we are fit and ready for succeeding in a globalized world by investing in skills and technology and expanding our universities, by investing in science. And actually, you see whole industries new industries with skilled jobs, middle-class jobs, growing up. Let me give you one example, fintech, which I think has enormous opportunities for collaboration, financial technology between India and Britain, particularly perhaps in the light of demonetization. There's an enormous opportunity for fintech. There were virtually no jobs in fintech back in 2008, 9, 10. There are now in Britain something like 75,000 jobs in this effectively new industry. So I don't think we should take a sort of Luddite view that middle-class, middle-income jobs have gone and we can't replace them. We need to keep investing in the new industries that are creating those new jobs.
So is this basically a failure to communicate? Is it, I mean, if
no, there are some real things. I wouldn't argue it's a failure. I think we let the argument for free trade go by the board and we need to remake that argument. But no, I'm not making an argument this morning this is all about presentation or communication. There are two real things happening in terms of people who have been left behind, who we need to help, and there's a real thing happening in terms of cultural identity and uncertainty and concern, which again we need to address. And I think when you look across Europe, I would argue Britain has tried harder to address some of those questions, not least by having a European referendum and consulting the people about this very important part of our political system. And I think other countries have got to recognize that you must listen to the concern, both economic and cultural, in order to save the future globalization, which will actually lead to greater wealth creation. Okay. And the mainstream parties have got to do it. If you leave this to the extremes, that is when we'll really suffer.
So let me ask another question. This obviously is something of great anxiety to all of us, to all people of color. The rise of the extreme right across the Western world is accompanied also by the rise of whether it's the new racism or it's the old racism in new garb. Forces seem to have been unleashed across the world, and every day in our newspaper and others, we report incidents of Indians or other people of color being attacked, being harassed, and worse, places of worship being attacked or threatening letters being sent. You can imagine the anxiety that causes to us who see the West as an example, and to us who thought that the West had discussed all these and sorted them out a generation ago. Can you explain the return of racism and how anxious should we be, and what is the challenge for Western leaders now, and how do you address it?
Well, I think the truth is that the fight against racism, intolerance, discrimination is never entirely won. You have to fight it again in every generation. You have to make sure you remember, recall, and educate people about appalling instances of discrimination in the past. One of the things I did as Prime Minister was to put a lot of effort and work into making sure we properly commemorated the Holocaust and its effect on the United Kingdom. So the fight is never truly won. I would, though, offer a word of reassurance, which is, as I said in earlier question, I think Britain is a genuinely multi-ethnic, multiracial success story, where you still see some evidence of discrimination. Of course you do, but it is a world away from 30, 40 years ago. You just take, for instance, the national game of football. I mean, I'm old enough or young enough or whatever to remember not that many years ago appalling instances of racism in football that has almost entirely in our country been wiped out. So and as I say, you can see role models in every aspect of British life, from whether it's from India or Pakistan or East or West Africa or the Caribbean. I think we have a real claim to be a genuine multiracial success story. So I would say we've never fully won the fight. We must keep doing that.
But it's not just winning the fight. It seems like it was one thing to keep fighting the fight when the racist elements had been reduced to the fringe. But now you hear mainstream politicians saying things that 10 years ago would have been considered appalling. And now it's being said in the open. You have Nigel Farage and people like him across the Western world. Well,
I think the answer is you have to condemn the racism, the xenophobia, the discrimination. But you have to take away from the populists the mainstream issues that give them a proper platform. So if in Europe we don't address the economically left behind, if we don't address concerns about immigration and movement of people, if we don't address skepticism and uncertainty about the European project itself.
Are those
you
the only
give
reasons
these people,
for the-
those I would say, you know, what lay behind. You can look at Sweden and the Swedish Democrats. You can look at Holland and the Geert Wilders Freedom Party. You can look at France and Jean-Marie Le Pen. You can look at
Greece, you
Britain and
mentioned
UKIP.
earlier.
And
Sure.
you know, if I take Britain, you know, the legitimate issues we need to address are the economically left behind, historically high rates of immigration that people feel aren't sufficiently controlled, and yes, also, you know, the way that Europe developed in a way that people didn't feel comfortable with. Now, if we address those three things, all these people are left with those unpleasant and discriminatory views, and they'll be called out for what they are.
We've only got a couple of minutes left, so I didn't want to let you go without putting you on the spot a little bit. Why does the English cricket team suck?
I don't accept that for a minute. I mean, it wasn't many years ago, as Prime Minister, I had the enormous privilege of watching England versus India at the Oval, and it was a wonderful hot summer's day, and I was able to go into the dressing room afterwards, and two English batsmen, Ian Bell and Kevin Peterson, had scored centuries, and when they score a century, they're allowed to have a bottle of lager in the dressing room afterwards, and I was able to hand those. That was a very proud moment. So we've seen ups and downs. I think the exciting thing for both of us is at the moment India is the #1 team, England is the #2 team, and it's going to be a great contest. But I look at our team, and I think any global team would have Joe Root in as a batsman. I think Alistair Cook's one of the greatest batsmen in the world today. Jimmy Anderson's one of the best bowlers in the world today. So we've got our stars.
If you could have one player from the English team, from the Indian team.
Well, I don't want to pick someone out and spoil them, but you've got a very strong team, and it's been a great contest. But and I will be.
Doesn't seem much like a contest.
Well, don't. What do they say that pride can come before a fall?
Okay, we have literally one last question. Several people have asked, what next for David Cameron?
Well, I'm writing a book about my time in politics and how I got involved in this life, the things I believe in and the causes I'm going to keep championing. I'm going to do that. That's the first thing. I'm going to promote some pro bono issues that I care about. There's a scheme in Britain called National Citizen Service, which is now the fastest growing youth volunteering program anywhere in the Western world, and I'm going to be its president. I'm going to put a lot of effort into trying to help tackle the scourge of dementia and Alzheimer's. I think that this is both something vital for our world. It's something where British science can make a massive contribution, so I'm going to be working on that. I'm going to keep up my interest in development. That's why I've been so interested to see your demonetisation debate this week, and particularly working with Professor Paul Collier at the Oxford School of Government. I've been doing some work with him and hope to continue with that. And then as for the future, I don't know. I had a bit of a shock this week when I arrived here and a copy of the Asian Age newspaper was left in my hotel room. And previously when I came to India, I was always hopeful that there'd be something on the front page about Cameron fighting for this or fighting for that. There was a Cameron on the front page, but it was my wife and the launch of her new fashion label. And I think the truth is I'll be doing a lot more of taking the kids to school and cooking the dinner, and it's time to pass the baton over to her.
Well, I hope you'll come back and talk to us again.
I'll be
David
delighted.
Cameron, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. May I request the Chairperson and Editorial Director, HD Media, Mrs. Shobna Bharatiya, to please present Mr. Cameron his mementos, including the caricature made by Liza Donnelly.
Thank you very much. That was a great session. They're really, really enjoyable. Thank you. Thank you. They're absolutely brilliant. They are very good. She is absolutely brilliant. So lovely. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.